The last episode or video that you watched on this topic left off with a very exciting cliffhanger, which was Wegener's theory wasn't accepted because he couldn't explain the force that moved the continents. So, what is that force that moved the continents? People have been dying to know. We want to know. Tell us, Mr. J. You will find out right after I tell you a little story. So this guy is another scientist who plays a pretty big role. His name is Harry Hess. There is a video down here, which I'm going to highly recommend that you watch. Bill Nye explains this whole thing better than I will, but I'm going to give you a little bit more context about it right now. So Harry Hess worked for the United States, I believe it was the Navy, and he made a very important discovery. So they wanted to figure out how can you best land on German soil, right? It would be really useful to know how deep the ground was so you can get your boats in there. What's a strategic place that you can basically pull up your boats and unload people on? Great. Now, the way that you could do this is by using like a sonar method. So you basically, the way it works is you send like a sound wave and it bounces off something that's there and it comes right back. So something that's close bounces off very quickly. Something that's further away takes longer to bounce back. And you keep doing this and you can basically map out the ocean floor. And when they're doing this, you would expect that the ocean floor is going to be pretty universally like flat. Like it's all just going to be totally flat, like the way that like, the beach would be. It's like here's the beach, and then the water is kind of like above that sand level, and it's all flat, just like the way most beaches are. That's not what he found at all. He found that there are certain places that are really far down. It's like a reverse mountain, sometimes called a trench. Some are really deep, and other ones are really high up. It's like underwater mountains that he figured out. So this was key in figuring out what was causing the tectonic plates to move. The name of that force is something called seafloor spreading. So I would like for you to write this whole thing down. Seafloor spreading occurs at that underwater mountain range I just told you about, which is called the mid-ocean ridge. It's in the middle of the ocean, and the ridge refers to like a mountain ridge or a mountain chain. It is the longest mountain chain on Earth. So it's not the Andes, not the Appalachian Mountains, not the Rocky Mountains, not the Himalayas, all long, imposing, important mountain ranges on Earth, but this is the longest one. Not the tallest one, definitely not, because it starts at the bottom of the ocean, and most of them never get too far up. So it starts, let's start at Iceland. You can follow my mouse over here. It travels all the way down here in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And this specific part of the mid-ocean ridge is often referred to as the mid-Atlantic ridge. You're going to hear those terms be used interchangeably back and forth. And it starts here going all the way through, but it actually continues all throughout the ocean floor, all the way throughout. I know it's hard to see over here, but you can see this dark spot shows the elevated land that's there. Of course, nobody sees this regularly on most maps unless you have a map that emphasizes the difference in elevation or mountain chains there. So it starts here. Now, what this is also showing is the boundary between different tectonic plates. So every time you see this elevated land, that is the boundary between the plates. And what we found is that the plates are spreading. They're moving apart. And you can see that a little bit better right over here. So during the process of seafloor spreading, molten material, which is called magma or lava when it hits the surface, rises and erupts. Why does it rise up? Because that hot stuff, the hot rock, is less dense things tend to rise up. And when it erupts out of those underwater volcanic mountains there, it spreads out. So it falls back down, it cools and hardens on the surface, but it's constantly happening. So it's constantly creating this new layer of crust. And because it doesn't just build upon itself, it doesn't only do that, it also pushes away the older crust. So it pushes older crust away from the ridge. And you can see this happening here. Here's the mid-ocean ridge. Underneath, the magma rises up, cools and hardens right there, and gradually pushes older and older crust away. So the youngest crust that exists on Earth is right here at the mid-ocean ridge. This is brand new crust, new lithosphere. And then the older crust is much further away. So this is in theory what's taking place. You can see it's kind of like a conveyor belt. So imagine a conveyor belt if you're at the grocery store and you put your items on it and it moves across. So imagine two conveyor belts that are both moving away opposite from each other. But it never has an opening there for very long because as soon as that opening happens, the magma rushes up and it cools and hardens right there and it adds a new layer to it. And this entire mountain range takes place over there. Now, somebody asked me once upon a time, well, if new crust is being created there, shouldn't it be really lower down? Why is all the rock raised up compared to everything else? Great question. And it's because this rock is so much hotter than the nearby rock because it's near this magma source. And what causes that rock to kind of spread out and take up more space, less dense rock than the surrounding rock. So that's why it rises up. But it never gets too high. It never gets so big that it pops out of the ocean at this point because it's constantly moving that rock further and further away. Now, you may be starting to think, okay, I'm buying this. New crust is being created over here. But if that were to happen, what happens to the old crust? Because if constantly new crust is being created, then the Earth should be growing and getting bigger over time. But the Earth is not significantly getting bigger over time. There's a little bit of accumulation that takes on from meteorite impacts, but it's not like the outside is spewing, the inside is spewing out to the outside, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So what has to happen is we have to recycle the old crust. So that's what happens here. In time, the older crust sinks back down into the mantle at a place called deep ocean trenches in a process called subduction. So sub, like submarine, means underneath. So this is what's going on here. The older crust sinks back down, and then when it sinks back down at these deep ocean trenches, a trench is like a reverse mountain. If a mountain is sticking out of the ground, a trench is sticking into the ground. And if my hands are two different plates, one plate goes underneath the other one, and then this part where my fingers are start to melt back down into mantle, back into the magma. And then that gives fuel for new crust to form at those mid-ocean ridges. So you have subduction zones, which take place over here, right? So this plate is being recycled, and then new crust comes out right over here, and it's just constantly recycling itself. The way that all of this happens is because of these what's called convection currents. So notice how the heat rises, because that's what heat does. It rises, and then the colder part sinks back down. So imagine this, okay? This is all liquid hot rock. I mean, hotter than anything you can imagine deep inside of the mantle right over here. But it's actually hotter way down here than it is at the top here. Again, up here is unimaginably hot rock to us. But compare that to the much hotter rock down there. So what happens is that the liquidy hot rock rises up to the top. When it gets up here, it actually cools down relative to down here. So it sinks back down where it heats up again and it rises back up. So you have these gigantic plumes of magma that's constantly cycling back and forth. This is a type of heat transfer called convection. A convection oven works the same exact way. When you boil a pot of water, the same thing happens. Again, if you were to touch the top of boiling hot water, highly recommend you do not do that. It's going to be really hot up there, but it's actually hotter at the source of the flame at the bottom. And that's how all that motion gets created from that heat. And that's what generates that heat, is from the heat source down here. And then that's what makes the water hot all throughout. So you can see over here, this is one of my favorite GIFs that I'm going to refer to over and over and over again. You see that conveyor belt I was telling you about. But when the oceanic crust comes into contact with the continental crust right over here, you see that the oceanic crust subducts or moves underneath that continental crust, and it starts to melt. And when it melts, it provides fuel for the volcanoes that are generally at the edge of these subduction zones right over there. So that is subduction taking place there. It's hard to imagine because this is zoomed up. This is like millions and millions of years that you're seeing within seconds. This takes place over an incredibly long period of time. We're just zoomed, like fast forwarding it so you can kind of try to imagine how it's taking place. So here's a mid-ocean ridge like we were talking about. See how the mid-ocean ridge kind of sticks up a little bit because of that heat, sometimes referred to as a rift valley, because we mentioned that before. Seamounts, which is an interesting thing, are kind of like individual volcanic mountains, but they don't become big enough to become islands because they're not sticking out of the water. This video is one of my favorite videos, and I'm going to show it many, many times. I'm going to attach it. I cannot recommend it enough that you watch it because it shows visually that convection current taking place, and you can kind of imagine what's strong enough to take these two plates and move them apart from each other. It's that gigantic conveyor belt that causes the seafloor spreading to move apart. So that is seafloor spreading.